Welcome to Le Grand Voyage with Chateau Malatic La Gravière. In September and October 1864, the United States was in the thick of the Civil War. Earlier that year, President Lincoln had appointed Ulysses Grant the commander-in-chief of all the Union armies. In England, things were quieter, but there was still some unease as the authorities had legalised overarm bowling in cricket. In Bordeaux, they were bringing in the harvest of grapes. The winemakers in the chateau will have known it was a good vintage, a very good vintage. But it's hard to imagine that they would be making wine that would still be considered not just drinkable but delicious well over a century later. Those few bottles that remain today are still excellent. The late, great Michael Broadbent considered 1864 to be one of the greatest vintages of the 19th century. One of a very fine pair. The 1865 was a little sturdier but still dependable. But what is it that allows these wines to drink so well, to age so well for so long? Can you keep all Bordeaux wines for so long? Reds as well as whites, dry as well as sweet? As you might have guessed, the answer is no. And around the world, 90% of wine is made to be drunk within the year, 99% made to be drunk within 5 years. Bordeaux certainly bucks that average. It's the world's premier fine wine region. It's got estates who've spent hundreds of years refining the processes and the expertise needed to make wines capable of aging for 5, 10, 20 years, even longer. But for really long-lived wines, you need to look to the finer reds, the sweet wines of Sauternes and Barsac, and the top producers of Bordeaux's perennially underrated whites. I've been lucky to try some very old Bordeaux, and they show the qualities that truly long-lived wines need. I once shared a bottle of 1959 Haut Brion with some work colleagues at a restaurant in Edinburgh. It was a ripe and opulent vintage, and it still had that dense fruit and the extract that a wine needs for a long life. By the time we got to it, the acidity and the tannin had faded, but they had to have been there to preserve that wine for all those years in the cellar, to keep that fruit alive and fight the ravages of time. I was also lucky enough to try this twice. I say lucky in more a historic sense. 1943 was a good vintage in its time, but by the time I got to it, at that same dinner as it happens, the fruit had faded along with all the other parts of the wine. There was a quick whiff of what once had been, and then, I suppose, like the light, delicate fabric in an Egyptian tomb exposed for the first time to light and air, it kind of crumbled away in front of us. So we can see that for a long life, wines need a balance between fruits, acidity and tannin, and they need concentration to survive the wait. In Bordeaux, the high proportion of Cabernet Sauvignon, many of the region's finest wines, really helps. The grape's thick, dark skins and fresh acidity give plenty of heft in the blend. This can be concentrated by a very low yield, like the legendary 1945 vintage, or by perfect ripening conditions in the run-up to harvest, like the famous 1928 vintage, or even searing heat in the summer, packing the grapes with sugars, like the very long-lived 1870 vintage. Winemaking may have changed, but the qualities that make for great wines really haven't. Among red wines, 2018 has the sort of power and tannins that will make it a long-lived vintage, whereas 2014 has the kind of supple mouthfeel and perfume that make it, frankly, the perfect vintage to enjoy whilst you wait. Among the dry whites of Bordeaux, 2018 is a vintage to enjoy now in its glorious youth and freshness. And when a suitable occasion comes up, delve into the darker reaches of your cellar and pull out a 2012 or a 2010, which have the concentration, the weight and the structure to evolve into gorgeous complexity. For sweet Bordeaux, 1983 is gorgeous, 1989 is operatic, 2014 is a vintage to stow away for another day, maybe even leave as a legacy for your children, grandchildren, great-grandchildren. And that's one of the magical things about wine. I've drunk the same wine as Napoleon. There are people still drinking wine made in the time of Lincoln and Queen Victoria. You just have to choose your vintages carefully and be very, very patient. You don't have to be too patient though. Join us again tomorrow when we'll have another story from the Chateau of Bordeaux with Le Grand Voyage. I'll see you then.